Hi everyone. Today we're going to look at Psalm 132 and how this psalm teaches us the importance of obedience and why it's crucial in our discipleship journey. If we're serious about being disciples of Jesus, then we need to take obedience seriously. To unpack this psalm and appreciate more about obedience, I'd like to help us think about this topic in three ways. Firstly, what is obedience really? Secondly, what can we do to practice obedience well? And thirdly, what happens when we live an obedient life? Let's dive straight in. Firstly, what is obedience really? What comes to mind when you think of obedience? If you do a simple Google search for synonyms for obedience, these words might pop up. Compliance, duty, respect, discipline, conformity, submission, passivity, subservience. Yikes, that doesn't sound very enticing. No wonder us Christians don't like talking about obedience to God. When we think about obedience, we often think about being boxed into a rigid framework. We're required to be submissive to the point that we'll eventually lose our identity. I grew up in a culture where that was exactly what obedience meant. I used to go to a Chinese Australian church. For those who don't know what I'm talking about, a typical Chinese Australian church has two main congregations. The parent congregation, which is comprised of Asian adults, and the English congregation, which are made up of the second generation Asian kids. I was the golden child at church. I was there every Sunday, often one of the earliest with my family, and I'd stay for all church activities. I knew my memory verses, I'm good at retelling stories, I was never outspoken, and I'd never talk back to adults. There was even a rumor that all the mums wanted their daughters to hang out with me and their sons to marry me. I was the golden child because I was good at being obedient in the eyes of Asian adults. But unfortunately, not my brother. He was, as the Asian mums and dads secretly thought, the rebellious child. Honestly, he wasn't bad at all. My brother was just very different to me. He's more extroverted, creative and passionate. And so for a lot of people in the church at that time, he seemed like the type to be a wild child and misbehave. He doesn't like to conform, and so a lot of the Asian adults used to try and beat him into submission. Not literally, obviously, but that was the kind of experiences we grew up with. Earlier, we heard Kenny share about his experiences in the army, and that blind obedience was what he had to do as a soldier. So, from a Christian perspective, what is obedience really? I don't think that when God calls us to obedience, he's calling us to be the golden child that I once was, or the obedient soldier Kenny was trained into. I don't think God's definition of obedience is for us to show up to church early every week, recite all our memory verses, never be outspoken, and never have an opinion about anything. That kind of obedience is a cookie-cutter method to make people conform to certain values and cultural norms. Today, I'd like to use Psalm 132 to explore what God teaches us obedience really is. Interestingly, this psalm makes a reference to the story of David returning the Ark of Covenant back to the tabernacle. It's actually a really cool story, and after you understand it, it'll help us understand and appreciate more fully the heart of what obedience means. Let me read for you again verses 1 to 5, and then I'll explain the story. Lord, remember David and all his self-denial. He swore an oath to the Lord. He made a vow to the mighty one of Jacob. I will not enter my house or go to my bed. I will allow no sleep to my eyes or slumber to my eyelids till I find a place for the Lord, a dwelling place for the mighty one of Jacob. David refuses to sleep until he finds a dwelling place for the Lord. In the Old Testament, God chose to dwell in the Ark of Covenant, which was meant to be in a sacred place called the Holy of Holies, inside the tabernacle. There was a time in Israel's history when the Ark of Covenant was stolen, and later it was tossed back and forth like an unwanted soccer ball. The tabernacle was established in Exodus, and God's glory descended in the tabernacle. The Ark of Covenant is a physical symbol of God's presence. It is sacred and holy. When we read up to 1 Samuel, we find out that the Philistines had taken the ark away from the Israelites. They carried the ark back to a temple in Ashdod called Dagon's temple and set it there. But they didn't realize the power of God, because not only did God make the statue of Dagon fall on his face before the Ark of Covenant, but God also inflicted tumors on the people living in Ashdod. They were so afraid of what happened. They said, "The Ark of the God of Israel must not stay here with us, because his hand is heavy on us and on Dagon, our God." They wanted to get rid of the Ark of Covenant. And so they asked the Philistine rulers for a conference call, and they said, "What shall we do with the Ark of the God of Israel?" What did the Philistine leaders end up saying? They answered, "Have the Ark of the God of Israel moved to Gath." And so the Ark moved to Gath. Guess what happened at Gath? God afflicted the people of the city, both young and old, with an outbreak of tumors. Guess what the people of Gath did next? They sent the Ark of God to Ekron. It's so funny that as they were taking the Ark to Ekron, even before the Ark was settled in a temple or place, the people of Ekron already wanted to get rid of it. 1 Samuel chapter 5 verses 10 to 11 says, "As the Ark of God was entering Ekron, the people of Ekron cried out, 'They have brought the Ark of the God of Israel around us to kill us and our people.' So they called together all the rulers of the Philistines and said, 'Send the Ark of the God of Israel away. Let it go back to its own place, or it will kill us and our people.' The Ark kept moving back and forth between the Philistines. In the end, it ended up at a place called Kiriath Jearim. 1 Samuel chapter 7 verse 2 tells us that the Ark remained there for 20 years. For 20 years, the Ark of Covenant, the physical presence of God, was not in the tabernacle where he wants to be with his people. Did the Israelites forget about God? Perhaps they did. The message it conveys to us is that the Israelites didn't seem to care too much about whether or not God's presence is with them or not. And then this is where David's story intersects here. Not long after David becomes king, he decides to take the Ark of Covenant back to Jerusalem and into the tabernacle. He failed the first time because he didn't handle the Ark properly. 2 Samuel chapter 6 tells us this story. David set the Ark of God on a new cart, and Uzzah and Ahio were guiding it. When the oxen stumbled, Uzzah reached out to try and straighten the Ark, but God immediately struck him down. David thought that his method to use a cart to transport the Ark, would be a better way to honor God. But there was only one way, and that's the only way God wanted his people to handle the Ark. The only acceptable way is to put bars through rings attached to the four corners of the Ark, and then only Levites could transport the Ark by carrying those bars. This was an important lesson for David and us to learn that obedience is not flagrantly doing things that we think God would be pleased with. It's not about getting a new cart to transport the Ark. Or in modern terms, it's not about driving the Ark around with a Tesla. It's knowing what God wants us to do and obeying his will. David learned from his mistakes. His second attempt is recorded in 2 Samuel chapter 6 verses 12 to 16. There were lots of celebration, and even King David laughed and danced before God. It was worth the massive party because after 20 years, King David finally brings the Ark of God back to its rightful place. Psalm 132 sings about David's heart to return the Ark back to the tabernacle. For so long, God was not with his people, and David couldn't sleep knowing that God's presence is not with them. "I will not enter my house or go to my bed. I will allow no sleep to my eyes or slumber to my eyelids till I find a place for the Lord, a dwelling for the mighty one of Jacob." When have you vowed not to sleep because something was so urgent in your heart? Was it to pull an all-nighter to finish an assignment or study for an exam? Was it for work? Was it a TV show that you had to finish? David was a man after God's own heart, and rightly so, because he put God first in his heart. What an awesome role model for us to see that David will lose sleep not because of work or studies, and not because of a TV show or a game. and not because of his wife or children. He lost sleep over God's presence in his life. He valued the importance of the ark. He knew what the ark symbolized, and he wanted God to be back in his rightful place. He didn't rest until the ark was returned to Jerusalem. From King David's example, we can see that obedience is putting God first in our lives. Isn't it sad to see that God desires to dwell with his people, but we seem to have little care about being with God? Remember the story from 1 Samuel. The writer tells us that the ark was left in a foreign land for 20 years. For 20 years, God's presence was not with the Israelites. So where is God in your life? Is he in your heart? Or is he far away someplace that you've forgotten about him? You probably don't care where he is or what he thinks about you. You probably don't want to have a relationship with him. He's just someone you could call on when you need help. But that's not what obedience is. Obedience begins from the heart. It's a desire to be with God and to put him first in our lives. If God is not first in our lives, any kind of obedient behavior is just idolatry. It's trying to put us on a pedestal, bring glory and honor to ourselves. It's exactly what Jesus was so angry about against the Pharisees. In Matthew chapter 23, verses 13 to 39, Jesus pronounces 7 woes against the teachers of the law and Pharisees. He said, "Woe to you, you hypocrites! You shut the door of the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. Woe to you, you hypocrites! You travel over land and sea to win a single convert, and yet when you have succeeded, you make them twice as much a child of hell as you are. Woe to you, you hypocrites! You give 1/10 of your spices, but you have neglected the more important matters of the law: justice, mercy, and faithfulness." The Pharisees and teachers of the law were outwardly holy and obedient, but inside they were the total opposite. Like David's first mistake with the handling of the ark, the Pharisees thought what they did pleased God, but actually they didn't understand God's heart at all. Obedience must come from a heart to put God, not ourselves, first in our lives. But even when we do put God first in our lives, it's hard to obey him and follow his word. How then do we practice obedience well? This leads us to our second question to think through today. What can we do to practice obedience well? So we have the right motives, but we're lacking the will to live that Christian life that emulates Jesus. When we look at the stories in the Bible and even reflecting on our own lives, what you'll notice is that often the more we trust someone, the easier it is to obey them. Let me ask you something. Who do you listen to most? Or who do you ask for advice? I bet the person you're thinking of is also someone you trust. Why would you listen to someone if you don't trust them? Can I give you an illustration? When I was young, I was really jealous of my brother when he first got glasses. I thought he looked really cool with them, and I wanted to have what he had. And so I started watching a lot of TV, but at the same time I would sit really close to the TV screen. I wanted to make my eyes bad so I could get glasses. My mom worked out really quickly what I was trying to do. She said to me, "Rachel, you'll regret getting glasses." I didn't believe her. I kept watching a lot of TV up close, and I even lied a bit when I went to the optometrist. When the optometrist asked me to read a line of letters, I pretended to get some wrong. Finally, I was prescribed glasses in year 7. By that time, I was no longer as excited about glasses, but a girl's got to commit to whatever she set her heart on. Am I right? At first, I was told to wear them during class, but gradually I had to wear them constantly because my eyes did get pretty bad. And I still remember to this day what my mum said years ago. "Rachel, you'll regret getting glasses." And I still do. I'm wearing contacts right now, so I'm really thankful for whoever invented contacts. Today, whenever my mum imparts wisdom to me, I'll always think twice before I dismiss her. Trust and obedience should go hand in hand. When obedience is forced out of fear, we will grow resentful and bitter. But when obedience comes from a place of trust, we will grow in relationship with the person we are obedient to. The discipleship journey calls us for obedience to Christ, but at the same time, God desires to be in an authentic and loving relationship with us, which is why trusting God must be infused with our obedience to Him. Trusting God as a motivator for obedience is so helpful for us. God is trustworthy. He's shown us in Scripture, and He'll prove it in your life too. You have to give Him a chance. You have to trust that He wants the best for you, and you have to obey Him to let Him work in your life. Trust and obey. Obey His word. You'll find God's instructions in the Bible. Do you trust God? How much do you trust Him? How much you trust Him will reflect how much you choose to obey Him. The really cool thing about this is the more we get to know God, the more we trust Him and the more we want to obey Him. Because we know that when we obey Him, it will be a lot faster for God to lead us down the right path. Obedience leads to blessings, which I'll talk about in our final part. But before I do, I'd like to touch on one last thing about trust and obedience. The Bible gives us lots of clear instructions. There are lots of things that are really clear, but we know that the Bible doesn't address every situation in our lives. If and when you come to those points in your life, can I suggest you seek a mature Christian who you trust to help you work through what you should do? If someone asks you for advice and guidance, can I also recommend that you make sure you know they do trust you before you guide them? Trust between both parties is so important. Now, the final part I'd like to look at with you today is thinking through this question. What happens when we live an obedient life? Understanding the answer to this question will actually motivate us to become more obedient, because to walk in obedience to God is to walk the path of God's blessings. Sometimes we Christians get it wrong. We think that if we obey God, He'll bless us and keep us safe from bad things happening to us in life. But that's not true. Part of our discipleship journey is living out obedience to God. Living in obedience must come with a growing relationship with God, because if we don't grow in relationship with Him, we'll actually learn to trust Him less. The more we trust God, the easier it is to obey. And so as we strive to become obedient to God, we're also growing in relationship with Him. And as we grow in relationship with God, we're also striving to become obedient to Him. Can you see how it goes hand in hand? As we obey and grow in relationship with God, we actually find ourselves receiving the blessing that God had originally promised Abraham. We are blessed to be in God's presence. Psalm 132 verses 13 to 16 says, "For the Lord has chosen Zion. He has desired it for His dwelling, saying, 'This is my resting place forever and ever. Here I will sit enthroned, for I have desired it. I will bless her with abundant provisions. Her poor I will satisfy with food. I will clothe her with priests with salvation, and her faithful people will ever sing for joy.'" God's desire is to be with us. He's chosen Zion to be a resting place. When you look at the Bible, Zion is another name for Jerusalem. But Zion also symbolizes the future new heaven and earth. Hebrews chapter 12 verses 22a says, "But you have come to Mount Zion and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem." God has chosen Zion, Jerusalem, to carry out His salvation plan through Jesus, but God also has chosen to dwell with His people in heaven for eternity. He will rest there with us, and that's the greatest blessing for us, to rest in the Lord's arms, where all anxiety, depression, sadness, and pain fades away. We will be wrapped in God's love and joy. We will worship the glory and majesty of the Lord. The greatest gift you'll receive in obedience is the blessing of being with God. When we choose to obey God right here, right now, we'll find ourselves experiencing a taste of what it was like in the Garden of Eden before sin came into the world, and also a taste of what's to come. In Western culture, we hate the sound of being told to obey. The only time obedience is okay is if we're obeying our own desires and yearnings. It's all about trusting our heart and do what makes you happy. That's not what God teaches us to have a fulfilling life. Instead of trusting or obeying our own heart, God tells us to trust God first. Instead of doing what makes us happy, God tells us to do what makes Him happy first. Brothers and sisters, do you believe that when you learn to constantly obey God, you'll gradually find joy in your life too? The joy comes from the blessing of being in a loving and deep relationship with God. Today, I've asked 3 important questions, and I'd like to summarize them to finish off. Firstly, what is obedience really? The heart of obedience is putting God first in our lives. Not our will be done, no matter how much we think it will please God, but God's will be done. Secondly, what can we do to practice obedience well? Trust in the Lord. The more we trust God, the easier it is to obey Him. Trust and obedience are practiced in the context of being in a relationship with God. Finally, what happens when we live an obedient life? As we learn to trust and live in obedience, we'll gradually discover the joy of God's blessing to dwell with Him as He desires to dwell with us. Obedience is hard, but to walk this path is to receive God's blessing of His presence. Wherever you are in your life, I pray that you'll be encouraged to keep trusting and obeying the Lord. I'm sorry if you're experiencing a really hard time at the moment. If it's learning to be patient, please keep waiting. If it's learning to say no to constant temptations, please keep saying no. If it's learning forgiveness, please forgive. Our discipleship journey is toward a new heaven and earth. When Jesus comes back, we know it will all be worth it. As a response to this message, I asked Morgan to write a song on this theme. I hope through this song you'll feel led to worship God and be encouraged to continue pursuing God in faith and obedience. The title of this song is Make Holiness Bloom.
Trust you, to let go and rest in your promise instead. But my grip is close to unbreaking. Remind me of all that you said. Oh, I'll give you my heartache and make room for joy, 'cause you can redeem all the hope I destroyed. I'll take the next step in obedience to truth, and if I remain in the vine, you'll make holiness bloom. So I'll choose to believe you were over this and this. With your word, you silence the storm in my head. Let its light in the dark be my lamppost. I'll trust that you know what's ahead. Whoa, I'll give you my heartache and make room for joy, 'cause you can redeem all the hope I destroyed. So I'll take the next step in obedience to truth, and if I remain in the vine, you make holiness bloom. Give up my hesitance, your arms are always open, wider than my failure. So I'm keeping to the narrow way, 'cause that's where I know you've got me and you always have. When the lies of the enemy question where you're working, I know you've come through before. You hold true in the mystery, and you have always been with me. Help me, God, to stay to your course. I'll give you my heartache and make room for joy, 'cause you can